Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of ESG and Sustainability in Space. I'm thrilled to be here with you. My name is Nishan Degdarain, and I'm thrilled to be joined by...
I'm Miki Sode. Hi.
Excellent. Thank you, Mickey. I know it's a long distance podcast today, Mickey, coming in from Japan. And we're
Yep.
delighted today to be joined by Bill Diamond. Bill is the president and CEO of the SETI Institute based here in Silicon Valley. Bill, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nishan. Nice to be here. Hello, Mickey.
Hi.
Excellent. Bill, maybe we could start with you first by just explaining a little bit about what is the SETI Institute and what excites you the most about the space industry and where it's going now with the role of the private sector.
Sure. Well, the SETI Institute is a nonprofit scientific research, education, and outreach institution, as you said, based here in Silicon Valley in Mountain View. In fact, this is our 40th anniversary as a nonprofit research organization, so it's been a fun year. The SETI Institute, the name is an acronym which stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which is both an endeavor that is practiced by scientists around the world and first got its start in 1960, but it's also the name of the Institute. The Institute's mission is to understand and explore the nature and prevalence of life and intelligence in the universe. So we're basically interested in whether we are alone in the universe on this little blue planet or whether there's life beyond Earth, from its most basic forms of microbial life to potentially complex, intelligent, and technological life. So that's the nature of the work we do, which encompasses pretty much all the natural sciences. And in terms of the second part of your question, our interest or excitement, if you will, about the emerging commercial space sector and industry is, I would say, if not to the democratization of access to space, at least the lowering of cost of access to space. Because with commercial launch capability offered by companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Rocket Labs and others, we now have the ability to put payloads in space at a much lower cost. Our payloads of interest are scientific instruments. They're not things which generate revenue, but they're important for scientific purposes. And therefore, the cost of getting these payloads into low Earth orbit or elsewhere is a huge, if not the largest, factor of consideration. So the fact that we have access to space thanks to this commercialization and the conversion of space from purely the domain of governments to one of commercial interests is a positive sign, at least in terms of cost elements. It has other complications, but it's exciting from the point of view of affordability for doing science.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. I'm glad that you shared what SETI Institute is and what this effort, the mission is about. But because it's what strikes me is that you have, or your researchers in your community had such a very big, wide systems perspective, right? That covers education and exploration, but how the space technology and access to the wonders of the space offers, but also in a long term as well. Like your missions are inherently very long term. So, so that's why I think it's very it was sort of intentional for us to bring you onto our podcast to share that perspective. But if I may double click on what you said about what excites you about this burgeoning space economy from your point of view. I know that in February this year, you went to the United Nations to address on the roles of science and technology in addressing UN Sustainable Development Goals,
Right.
in particular, focusing on education and equity and sustainability and climate as well. So, so that's a lot to talk about there. Like I wanted to kind of get the quick, skinny version of what your address. But also on the other hand, I know that you are also involved in as a board member for a privateer which provides the geospatial intelligence across all domains, like from sea to space, right? So that means it's more action, actionable, tangible actions. And so just kind of setting that context, and again, if you may kind of elaborate on what excites you about this burgeoning space economy in terms of, benefit to our lives, as well as, actions to take, and then where we are going from here.
Sure. Well, I would say that, one of the great benefits of space as a platform on which to conduct science and do observations is, most of our work at the SETI Institute involves pointing instruments out away from Earth towards targets of interest, and using optical telescopes or radio telescopes. But there's also a lot to be learned by pointing instruments down at Earth. And, Earth is the only laboratory we have in terms of a planetary environment in which we know life, and indeed intelligent and technological life, exists. And so in many respects, SETI as an endeavor, or this search for extraterrestrial intelligence and this question about are we alone in the universe, starts here. And it is as much an introspection and learning about, what it means to be human, what our place is in the cosmos, how we even came to exist in the first place, as it is about, looking for other examples of life and biology elsewhere. So, we study the Earth as, the only existence there where life exists, and we can learn, therefore, on how to look for life and what its signatures of presence are in other worlds. And space, of course, is a great platform on which to observe Earth in the context of understanding things at planetary scale, its climate, its environment, its land masses, its weather, and the evidence that we can see from space of biology and life and technology. What are the biosignatures of this planet? What are the technosignatures of this planet? And what they look like from space. But equally, since one of the questions we have is, if life exists elsewhere, then it probably starts with a habitable environment. And we now know, thanks to the Kepler mission and other missions, that there are potentially billions of potentially habitable planets in our own galaxy where life may have had the opportunity, or may yet have the opportunity, to get started. But what is a habitable environment? And what defines that? What defines it for our kind of biology? And what about the sustainability or the permanence, if you will, of a habitable environment? And what happens when the presence of a particular species in a particular planetary environment changes what the habitability of that environment? And of course, space becomes a really interesting place on which to observe that phenomenon. Retreating glaciers, melting polar ice caps, warming sea temperatures, more dramatic and extreme weather. All of these things which we can observe from space and gain a much broader perspective on what's happening, how these dynamics work, and what impact they might have on the life below. So again, in the context of commercial space, or in improving access to space, the idea that more instruments and observational platforms can be deployed, which give us a better understanding of what's going on the planet below, in terms of life and environment and climate, the better. At the same time, we already have concerns about the overcrowding of space with instrumentation and satellites and so forth, and space debris, orbital debris, and just managing the complexity of thousands of objects, orbiting around our planet in low Earth orbit is not a trivial matter. So, like anything, these dynamics come with some really interesting and exciting positive attributes and characteristics, and then they come with, you know, some cost or some expense or some risk that has to be taken into account. So unfortunately, I've learned, the older I get, the more I learned that, you know, there's nothing for free. There's nothing that doesn't, in terms of technology or anything else, that doesn't come with consequences. The main thing is to be aware of that from the outset, to be smart enough to think about what are the consequences of doing A, B, C, or D.
Excellent. So yeah, that's really interesting when you talk about these trade-offs, right? The consequences and trade-offs that we have to face. It's not an infinite energy system.
Right.
I mean, you sit in a really unique position at a really unique time in history, right? Because I can see there's almost three dimensions to what you've talked about. You've described the importance of space technologies or space industry in looking down at Earth, how biology, how life on Earth is changing and evolving with changing glaciers, climate change, the loss of biodiversity and habitat destruction and changes as humans have, you know, and there's questions about, do we have the right institutions to do that if we look at what's... The second is, at some stage, there's a role of astrobiology. You know, we will need to grow or take DNA or life into space to grow plants on the moon, on space stations, on Mars. But that's with it, yeah, that's human earthbound life that we're taking, and we'll need a governance framework. And then that third aspect, as you said, of looking deep into space and habitable planets and what life could look like. And with each of these three horizons, traditionally, a lot of these have been the purview or the domain of large government organizations or publicly funded, taxpayer-funded scientific organizations, you know, whether it's from royal families or philanthropy, but they're typically non-profit. But now, as you mentioned, 90% of future activity in space is likely to come from the private, from the commercial sector. How do you see us kind of thinking about the discovery or governance of life in space with that in mind? Because it's such an early sector. We want to allow innovation. We want to, you know, there's unknowns. You point about like trade-off and consequences. And we don't want to over-regulate too early, but at some stage, we'll need to have some sort of governance mechanisms to control, you know, extinction of certain species, you know, human unintended consequences, is the ability to explore without impeding others' views of the cosmos. So how do you think about kind of the governance of the private sector with that context in mind?
Well, you know, it's a really interesting question. It's a big question. I would say, you know, I mean, regulatory frameworks and regulation, you know, somewhat has a negative connotation, right, in many respects. At the same time, I think one could argue maybe if the right word isn't necessarily regulation, but at least coordination. And I don't think it's at all too early to start thinking about coordinating efforts, you know, across different government organizations or entities and interests, because, you know, what we really can't afford to have, I don't think, is the Wild West in space. You know, this would be really problematic. And so I think it is important for there to be, you know, regulatory frameworks about, you know, the access to space, you know, orbit assignments and so forth, regulations about deorbit and, you know, light climb of spacecraft. And then there are bigger questions, like if we as soon as we bring humans to Mars, we will have brought life to Mars that is not Martian, right? And it will then be increasingly difficult for us, should we discover, you know, some biosignatures on Mars or evidence of life on Mars. The question will be, have we just discovered ourselves and the result of our presence here, or have we discovered something with its own, you know, biogenesis that is independent of our presence? So, you know, at some level, for those of us who are looking at this question of life beyond Earth, we'd like Mars to be left to a pristine environment that we can evaluate from a scientific point of view of its potential to having past or present life before we disturb it. Now, you know, it is inevitable that humans will be on Mars, and it may also be helpful in terms of the quest to look for life on Mars to have humans there who can, you know, do things that it's difficult for rovers and robots and things to do in the same way. But we, you know, we have to think about these things as we take biology, whether it's plant or animal or human, to other worlds. What are the implications of that? And so forth. And again, the discovery of life on Mars, even if it's something very basic, would have profound implications for what it means about the likelihood for life elsewhere, and particularly intelligent life elsewhere. So it's an interesting question, but I think that it is a fair question to say, well, what organization has the purview to do this kind of work? And I would have to say, as much as the UN falls short of what we might like to think about for global coordination of things, not least handling climate change, it's the best and only organization we have for global action, it seems. There are trade associations, there are regulatory bodies that are international, but they're not multinational necessarily, right? And UN, at least in theory, represents every country on the planet, and to the extent that we want every country on the planet to have a say, or to have access or have the opportunity to benefit from this future, and hopefully not to be victims of this future, it's a good place to start. But I don't have the answer to how that should be organized within the UN, and how it should be funded. And until they put me in charge, I don't know that I can problem right off the bat. But I think it's a great place to start, because this just like climate change and the environmental, I would call it, crisis that we have on our planet. This is a planetary scale phenomena. It's not happening over there or over here or only in this country or only in that country. It's happening over the whole planet. And until the governments of this planet and the countries of this planet come together as one and realize we are one human species on one tiny little island in a very insignificant solar system, our future is very much in doubt in terms of long-term sustainability. So I'm hopeful that humanity, through the UN or some other organization and mechanism, can unite on these issues, and not least access to and control of in some ways, or regulation of space, and how we use it and how we take advantage of it.
So, one question is, of course, who should lead the coordination? But flip side of it that I would like to ask you is, whose voice we haven't heard enough of that should be included in when we are co-designing, future that involves space as a fabric of our economy?
Well, to the extent that, again, every endeavor that humans undertake come with consequences, and ideally, when we're undertaking an endeavor that we think, has more benefits than it does detrimental impacts, that's a good thing. But nevertheless, no matter what we do, even if it's ostensibly, going to benefit humankind, it's going to come with some costs. And we have seen, for example, that the industrialization of our planet and its ultimate convergence to, in many places, a tech, going from we've gone from agrarian to industrial, now to technological, but we haven't done that across the planet. And the greatest beneficiaries of our technological ascent, if you will, have been, the well-funded, wealthy, Western countries, and well, of course, in Asia now as well. China, etc. So, not very many countries have really benefited from our ascent to a technological species, and many countries have become victims of our ascent to a technological species by bearing the brunt of things like climate change that are, let's face it, a cost, if you will, or a real consequence of our becoming both industrial and now technological. And so I think we need to think about access to space in that same context, in that, the beneficiaries, by and large, at least for the near term, are still going to be, the wealthy, industrialized, technological countries. And what are the consequences, potentially the unintended consequences, going to be for the rest of the world? And what negative consequences, for example, might there be? And might there also be a disproportionate, if you will, distribution of those unintended or bad consequences to countries that have don't have the access and aren't necessarily going to have the benefits of this new and emerging sector. So to your question, who should we invite? I mean, I think we should invite people around the table who represent those countries and those peoples and those parts of the world that haven't really been traditionally part of this technological revolution, if you will, to have a voice and have a seat at the table and have a say, and that we think about what are the implications and consequences for these peoples or these countries or these geographical regions of the world, as we continue to expand in this space commercialization.
That's fascinating and really interesting, because in many parts of the world, a lot of what happens in space is deeply enshrined. If there's no the capabilities there, deeply enshrined in individual cultures.
Sure.
Right? The presence of the moon, for example, is so profound in Islam, in Hinduism, in indigenous culture. The space of the stars, they have significant cultural implications. And just the concept of seeing life, for certain cultures, you'd worship the moon, then all of a sudden you see life and humans over there. That's going to create very profound value shifts. And we've already kind of heard some noise about how do we start to build a consensus? Like, do we build a consensus? But how can we even start to build a consensus around even the use of space? And when we look at Earth, we see two diametrically opposed areas. When you look at the poles, you've got the Arctic, which is built around exploitation, whether it's of fisheries or mineral resources, and a few nations controlling access and permissions to extract. But whereas Antarctica, to your point about the need to preserve this pristine environment, there has been a consensus that we will not extract from Antarctica. And so far, despite all the geopolitical tensions and the Cold War, we've managed to maintain that. One of our continents has remained largely pristine from human influence or extraction.
That's a great case study, and it's a great example for us to maybe take to other places like Moon and Mars for sure. Yeah,
and at the same time, Antarctica, governed by Kamala, is largely a government organization with NGO, civil society, some industrial representation. The governance of the internet is another kind of good example of the ICANN and how we create domain awareness. And your point earlier that maybe it's not regulation but coordination, right? More like an organic body that will need to evolve over time rather than being frozen in time. But how do you see us reaching some sort of consensus around the value system that will govern how we would operate or industrialize a space?
Yeah, well, so lots of different parts to that question. I would say one thing about Antarctica that is perhaps part of why this coordination and protection, if you will, of this pristine environment has been able to take place has probably been this perception in the private sector. Well, there's not a lot of money to be made down there, right? So, I mean, that could change as there's more melting and we actually get access to the continent that's underneath the ice. But it hasn't. If there were gold or oil or some other thing that was desperately needed, I think that the caution would be thrown to the wind, and these coordinated efforts might be cast aside for the interest of either profits or need, economic or otherwise. But I do think, nevertheless, it's been a very positive example of what we can do when we collectively decide to protect a given environment, or to at least coordinate, if not regulate, access and use of that environment. In terms of building consensus, I think a great way to start is to build consensus. which means having voices around the table with different perspectives and different interests, and giving everybody an opportunity to weigh in. That if you don't do that, if you only have the key beneficiaries or the key players who are able to actually take advantage of this new economy or this new paradigm space, that you're not building consensus. The people around the table may all agree, but you're missing half the world, or things along those lines. I think a good example is the bad example that we've seen in Hawaii, where we built observatories and did so with sort of ignoring the perspectives and views and religious and cultural importance of these prestigious, these precious areas, pristine areas where we wanted to build these observatories to the local people, to the indigenous people. And I think the same exact observatories doing the same exact science could have been built with everybody being happy about it if you'd had all the voices around the table at the beginning, that if you were respecting all the different viewpoints, and maybe integrating their viewpoints and perspectives into how you design and how you build and what you do there. I think it was a completely avoidable debacle if we had tried to build consensus. If we'd said, hey, we would love to work with you and with your people and with your cultural and understand it and integrate it into this thing that we want to do. That, by the way, we think gives all of humanity, this unbelievable access and knowledge that presumably we all can cherish and benefit from. So I think there's examples of where we've really screwed that up, and we could have done it differently. And that's what we should do here. So a great way to build consensus is to actually build consensus, which again, I just think means you've got everybody's around the table, and that you don't have, some beneficiary subset around the table that's ignoring, a sizable fraction of the planet.
Yeah, and that brings back to what we talked about early about the education and outreach being the core of what SETI does, right? Because if awareness and consensus comes from being aware of such tradition or sentiment to that holy land of that, of the land on Hawaii where this observatory was built, right. Or how each culture have different relationship to the moon, yes, yeah. All of that, or how important the night sky is to astronomer and all of that, right? Yes. So I feel I resonate a lot about what you do at SETI and your mission, because I think that's there are a lot for us to learn from what you do and people in your community in terms of building a more accessible, I guess a better access to space, so that we could all benefit from space-enabled data or knowledge of technology to for the betterment of our lives here on Earth and for the future. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe. Go ahead.
Finish your question.
No. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that this idea of engagement. I mean, the outreach. The point of the outreach and the education programs is to reach as many people as possible. In other words, to make everybody part of this endeavor. Our endeavor, our search for life beyond Earth is for all of humankind. It's not for the SETI Institute. It's not for Americans only. It's not for civil, industrialized or technological nations. It's for the whole planet. It's something that we do that we think is something meaningful and important to every person on Earth, and therefore sharing what we do with everybody we think is a responsibility we have, as much as we feel it's an important thing to do, but we think it's a responsible thing to do. And making people aware of this endeavor and what it entails and how we do it and what we've learned, and also how it reflects back on a better understanding of ourselves as a species, I think is important and useful. I mean, imagine, for example, if before humans put that first footprint on the moon, that, you know, the entity, the United States and NASA that was able to pull that off had gone and had conversations with people from Islam or from indigenous tribes, or, you know, people from different countries, and said, you know, we'd like you to make you part of this, that when that footprint goes on the moon, you're part of that footprint, you know. And that, again, this is, I mean, as Neil Armstrong said, you know, one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. You know, that this is really for everybody. But unless you engage and unless you build consensus, some people are going to feel left out and left behind. And I think this is too big, you know, an undertaking, and too big an opportunity, and so much tied to our future as a species, that everybody deserves to be heard and feel like they're involved and can benefit in some way.
Bill, I think on that note, we could speak all day, I think, on some of these ideas. But on that note, that's a really profound and insightful and inspirational legacy, that this is one giant leap for humankind. You know, that next frontier that we're about to embark on. And this is a chance for us to put our best foot forwards. I mean, some of the points that you mentioned over the course of this podcast in terms of the access to space for all communities, the need for coordination, not necessarily regulation, implies a whole different set of levers of influence and what institutions could look like, you know, when we mean institutions or coordination mechanism, and being inclusive, because sometimes you have to go far and broad rather than going fast, but then long term, that will actually create these profound leaps that civilizationally we will need if we look at it in those terms. I think they're really profound and important perspectives that we can bring in. Bill, we've run out of time. So from Mickey and I, thank you so much. We've really enjoyed today's discussion.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. It's a great topic. I'm glad you guys are diving into it, and we wish you many more great conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.